This is episode 163. Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Well, welcome back, friends. How are you? Let me tell you a couple of things. So it's Friday morning. I usually record in the evening, so this will be interesting. It probably might be a little loud here and there, but not to worry. That is life. It is Friday here, and we're getting a little bit tired of COVID-19. I'm not going to lie. My husband is getting a little irritable about the whole thing. I'm feeling really cooped up. The kids are doing mostly really great, but I am noticing these waves of what I call grief. And this is what we're going to talk about today. I know that when we talk about grief, we're usually talking about the emotions and experience you have after you lose a loved one, or, there's a very large catastrophe. And yes, COVID is that. And so, I think I've spoken to a lot of people and they've said, no, it's not grief. Grief is, reserved for people who have lost someone dear to them. And I'm really here today to sort of normalize the emotion and experience of grief and to give you permission to grieve, because what we're going through collectively as a human race is enough for you to admit and acknowledge and honor your grief. I find that grief rolls through me like a truck. I could be fine, I could be at the grocery store, and then it just hits me like a brick of the grief of my kids not seeing their friends and me not seeing my friends, and collectively all the people who are suffering right now, and the loss of people with work, and as I could go on, but I'm not going to, because I don't want to flood you with grief either, even though grief is a totally fine thing to feel. I wanted to talk about grief and to help maybe educate you a little bit about grief so that you feel like you know what's going on if that's what you get hit with. Often with clients, they may be hit with grief and I'll call it grief and they'll say, no, I don't think that's what it is. And we'll talk about it and they can't put a word to it. And often we do land on grief. And that's because grief has different stages and processes and emotions involved. And it can get pretty tricky and complicated and confusing. So quick sort of education here. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a psychiatrist and a researcher, identified 5 different stages of grief. And this is why sometimes grief is so confusing, because the way she conceptualized it is there are 5 stages. Now, the first stage is denial, which is sort of what I just talked about, right? I'll say to a client, I think you're grieving. And no, I'm not grieving. This is not a problem. I'm fine. That sort of denial of the pain and of the problem. It's ultimately where we go into shock. And often what we do is we isolate in this stage. No, I'm fine. I don't need to talk to anybody. No. And that is the stage of denial. There is nothing wrong with any of these stages, right? I'm going to go through them, but in the way I talk about them, I want you to really understand there's no judgment around these. These are normal stages that we go through. So the first stage is denial. That's usually where you deny this event happened, or you deny your feelings, or you isolate away from people so that you don't have to talk about the feelings. And that's totally fine. You might stay in denial for a little while, and that's okay. The second stage is anger. And this is a common one, right? And this is why people will say, no, I'm not in grieving, I'm just furious. And we might even look and go, yeah, I totally get that you're furious. And that's probably because you've just lost something. You are grieving the loss of something, and that makes us angry because it's not fair. It's not fair. And the life is not fair. Absolutely. Life is not fair. And so your anger about coronavirus or a loss of a loved one or whatever it is that you're grieving, some people even grieve their mental illness, right? They grieve what it's taken from them. They grieve what it has sort of stripped them of, their identity, their friendships, their relationships, time at work, weddings, events that they've missed because of the disorder. So grieving because of the illness is a total normal experience as well. And you will experience anger at different degrees. And again, I give you permission to feel angry about it. Anger is a very helpful and healthy emotion. But the thing to remember about anger is the purpose of anger is actually to push and propel us towards a solution. So as you can imagine, let's say you were out in the forest and you were approached by somebody who scared you, or, in Australia, we call it a dingo, and in America, we call it a coyote or something. Your instincts is anger, which is, I'm going to protect myself. I have to get myself away from this danger. And so I'm going to go into protection mode and fight. That's the reason we have anger. It's a very adaptive response to a struggle or a hardship, right? The problem is with anger, and this is something to keep an eye out for, is if you're angry, you want to project and push your anger onto the solution, right? You want to be angry about the problem, and then we want to move towards the solution. Often what we do is when we're angry, instead of moving towards the solution, we turn inwards on ourselves and we beat ourselves up. Idiot, what an idiot, I should have done better, all the things, right? And that anger can sometimes turn inward. So that's just something to keep an eye out for. The third stage is the bargaining stage. And this is another part of the grief process, which is bargaining is where we go over the event, we do an analysis of the event, and we start to go into this negotiation process in our mind. If only I had have done this, it would have been better. If only I had have done that, it would have been better. I could have prevented this from happening. If only I had have done, if only. That's bargaining, right? And it's a normal part of the grief process, right? If you've lost someone, you might go, if only I had have said this or done this or said, acted in a certain way earlier, maybe I could have prevented this loss. Now for COVID right now, you might be saying, if only I had have known, if only I could have done this, if only, the CDC, if only, like again, the bargaining stage is where we cling to these sort of ideas that sometimes they're very, very true and factful. Like, yes, if we had have known about it earlier, or if we had have done A, B, and C earlier, we would have been better. Yes, some of it is fact, but the action in which we are engaging in, this bargaining action, is a part of the grief process. It's an important part. Again, the only concern is when you kind of get stuck in it. That's where we want to intervene and change some behaviors. But ultimately, if this is where you are, that's okay. It's a part of the grief process. The fourth stage, and sometimes the most painful stage, is the depressive stage. And this is where you fall in a heap and you cry and you sob and you don't want to get out of bed and things feel really hard and you deeply grieve and you have a deep sense of sorrow. And sometimes that stage can involve feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, worthlessness, thoughts and ideas like, there's no hope, what's the point, nothing will go well for me now, it was my fault, I'm not worthy, no one can help me, this is a lost cause, those kinds of thoughts, right? And if you're really stuck in that phase, and it's okay if you are, because, I think a lot of people are experiencing a high level of depression because of this grief process of having COVID and the state of the world, right? In addition to maybe your mental illness that you were already coping with. If you're in that position, don't hesitate to reach out to a mental health professional or your medical doctor and say, hey, I'm struggling. right? My doctor, I had an appointment a few days ago, and his first question was, I'm going to assume you're depressed, right? I love that he was like, I'm going to assume that, right? And then he asked the question, like, how are you feeling? And he made that assumption given that he's already acknowledged the level of grief our worldwide earth is, under, right? And so there's no shame if you're struggling with that stage or any of these stages. The last stage is the stage of acceptance. And this stage is where you come to an acceptance of the situation, you come to an understanding, you're in a place where you can reintegrate into your life and sort of not move on, because you never move on, but you can integrate the grief and the loss into your life. Now, we're not really going to enter the acceptance stage until COVID has completely concluded itself, right? So don't push this stage, right? Some people get caught like, I just want to accept it. I have to accept it. Everything will be fine. And then I won't have to grieve anymore. No, that's probably not likely because, as I said, I could be in the middle of a session with a client and get hit by grief for reasons I can't even understand. I might be taking a walk and be listening to music and dancing and singing out loud, making a grand fool of myself, and then get hit by grief. These are stages, again, you can't demand which stage you're going to be in. You can't push it. You can't skip stages. And sometimes the stages are wacky. They go one here, and then you move to the acceptance, then you go to anger, then you move back to bargaining, and you're in depression, and you're all over the place. These steps aren't to tell you how to grieve. They're to acknowledge the normal experience of grief, right? And I hope that is helpful for you because, sometimes, like I said, you have these feelings and you're not quite sure what it is, which then makes it harder, right? Because you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know what's happening. What's happening to me? What's wrong with me? And there's nothing wrong with you. These are, normal processes that we go through during life. This will not be the last time you go through a grief process. With life, there is death and loss, and this is a part of life. And our job is to be our most compassionate, supportive friend throughout that as much as you can and as often as you can and as unconditionally as you can, right? Let's say you're stuck in a stage and you can't get out. Don't beat yourself up for that. It's not your fault. This is, we did not get a manual on how to be human. We did not get an instruction booklet that says, here is how you handle grief, A, B, and C, you're going to be fine. It doesn't work like that. We're very messy, but our goal is to be messy and still love and care for ourselves no matter what. So I just wanted to share that with you. As much for me as it is for you, because I have to sort of keep reminding myself like, oh, these stages of grief are just rolling through me. And sometimes they're rapid firing, right? Like for me, it's in the supermarket. I'm in the supermarket and I'm like, yay, look at me. I'm back into the world. I have my mask on and I'm getting groceries and life is getting back to normal. And then boom, I get hit with grief. And then I get hit with anger of like, I cannot believe this is happening. And then, I think these stages can be, you could rotate through all of them in less than a minute. And that's the nature of emotions. Okay, so that is what I want to share with you. There is one more stage. So following the death of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, there was another psychologist who created a final stage, which is called the making meaning stage. Now, you don't have to do this, but you can if you like. This is a stage where once you have grieved and you've gone into acceptance, or maybe even not, you go into a stage where you try to make the grief process in some way, you try and give it meaning and you try to turn your pain into a purpose. Now, sometimes people get really mad at this and they're like, no, I cannot. I refuse. I do not want to make anything positive out of this horrible experience. And that's fine. I think that this is just for whoever feels, compelled to do so. So an example might be even me today. Like, I'm grieving. If I'm going to grieve, I might as well share it with you. And I might as well try and educate you and maybe hopefully take a teeny tiny bit of the weight off your shoulders. If I can do that, that would be me making meaning of my own grief. That would be me turning some of my pain into purpose. And for me, that works today, but it mightn't work for me tomorrow, and it mightn't work for you at all. But some people find that this to be very healing, to sort of turn their pain into purpose and add this final stage to the grief process. But again, I'm always very reluctant to suggest that because I know sometimes people then judge themselves like, I don't want to do that, and so therefore I must be bad. And that is not true at all. If you're not there ready to take that sixth step ever or at all, that's fine. That's fine. Just, nurture your own process and be kind and do what you think is right for you. Okay? Okay. I love you guys. I hope that you are okay. I hope that you are finding some piece of joy in these very difficult days. If not, just keep reminding yourself it is a beautiful day to do a hard thing, and this is a very hard thing. So give yourself tons of grace. I love you. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next week. Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.